I'm Carolyn Watkins with Ohio EPA's Office of Environmental Education, and my co-presenter today is Alan Harness. And in a rough division of labor, I handle the money questions and he handles all of the engine and emission questions. So between the two of us, we will do our best to answer any questions that come up. And we'll continue as we get phone or email questions over the next several weeks. We'll continue to add that information to the website as well. This is the first of two webinars. We'll be going over the same information in the next webinar on June 23rd, so you will not need to attend both, but I would encourage you to check back with the Q&A as we update those on the website. And in this title slide, you have both Alan's and my email contact and the program website. So just a brief overview of where we're at with the program. This 2021 grant application cycle is limited to replacing or repowering diesel cargo handling equipment, both in ports and in distribution centers and airport ground support equipment and switcher locomotives. We have roughly 13.3 million available, and it is open to the applicants in any of our 26 VW priority counties. And the rough amount we have available is a little over 9 million for port and airport cargo handling and about 3.85 million for switcher locomotives. The grant will limit your request to between 50,000 and 2 million in the grant application software. We understand some switcher locomotive projects are very large and have much larger budgets than that. If you have a larger budget switcher project you are looking at, please, we encourage you to call Ohio EPA, talk with Alan and me, because we do have some other funding opportunities that we can patch together for somewhat larger projects. So be aware of that. So the request for applications was released this past Monday. We're doing webinars today, and on the 23rd, we'll update the Q&A. Please note that the deadline for applications is on August 13th, and it is at 3 p.m., not 5 p.m. If you try to submit it at 4:30, the system will have you locked out. So please pay attention to that, put that on your calendar, and we will definitely be able to announce awards by December 20 of 2021. We hope to be able to make announcements sooner than that. It will just kind of depend on how many applications that we receive and how complicated they are, how quickly we can get through them. So today's presentation, I'll give you just a very brief overview of the Volkswagen settlement, which is a court-supervised set of funds that have been allocated to the various states, and where we are in terms of using those funds in Ohio, and some lessons learned from the 3 previous grant cycles that we've done. We'll do some notes that apply to all applicants, and then a couple of things specific to the cargo handling equipment and the switcher locomotive sectors. And then we have some slides just showing you kind of how the online application software works. We had very good experience with the application software in the previous cycles. It's fairly easy to use once you get in there the first time. We've had some good feedback, and we've had some external folks helping us to test it before each grant cycle, and we appreciate their help. I think it's made it a better system. And in my experience, it's a whole lot easier to use than the federal grants.gov system, which some of us have the joyful experience of playing in. So quick overview, just in 2016, the United States and the state of California sued Volkswagen and their associated companies, alleging that they had installed defeat devices on certain of their diesel vehicles that turned off the emission controls. And that was of concern because while those emission controls were turned off, those vehicles were emitting quite a bit more nitrogen oxide pollution. And so the settlement was one of the largest settlements of this kind of environmental case in the history of the federal courts, $14 billion. So this is not a federal grant program. It's a settlement of a civil court case that was brought, or criminal court case, and it is being overseen by a federal court and a court-appointed trustee. So the $14 billion, $10 billion was used to compensate the owners of those vehicles who were able to have them bought back or repaired. $2 billion was awarded to a subsidiary of Volkswagen called Electrify America, and their mission has been to install chargers for electric vehicles or zero-emission vehicles across the country. And they had been busy doing that. By the end of 2021, they expect to have erected 800 public charging stations nationwide with about 3,500 charging ports. And in Ohio, they have installed chargers along the Ohio Turnpike, along I-70 and other locations within the state. The remaining $2.7 billion was allocated to all 50 states, plus Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the various tribes, to remediate the environmental effects of these excess NOx emissions that were experienced. So Ohio received just over $75 million. States are required to spend the funds over about 10 years based on the amount that each state receives is based on the number of vehicles that were registered in that state with the illegal defeat devices. And that was actually more than 16,000 vehicles in Ohio. So we followed the directions for all the states. We developed a beneficiary mitigation plan that said how we would allocate our funds among the 10 allowable uses based on the public comments we received. And we went through 2 rounds of public comment and submitted that to the VW trustee in 2018 and began. And the overriding purpose of these funds are to be used to impact air quality in areas that bear a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden. And so when Ohio developed its plan, everybody had ideas for how the money should be spent and where the money should be spent. And what Ohio EPA had to do was to weigh all of these factors. Where were the Volkswagen vehicles operated that were releasing the emissions that we're trying to now go back and offset? What are the most cost-effective ways to reduce emission? Where are our greatest needs in terms of improving poor air quality in the state? What are the allowable uses under the settlement that the trustee oversees? We also looked at where do we have funding in other programs versus no funding available to reduce diesel emissions and factored that in. And then, of course, what the public was asking for. So we used all of those to develop both a map of priority counties and a plan to spend the fund. We focused in on the first priority counties, which are the 15 counties that US EPA had designated as non-attainment for the federal air quality standard for ozone under the Clean Air Act. Those counties are the first priority to receive funding for projects that reduce emissions of NOx, nitrogen oxides, that cause ground level ozone smog. And just a heads up, some of these counties are about to be bumped up to a higher level of non-attainment for ozone. And so we will be looking when we, at the end of this year, sit back, take a deep breath, and look at how we've spent the VW funding and what might be left available. We will be looking closely at what those non-attainment areas are for priority going forward. So one overarching thing that we've tried to help everyone understand of the different allowable uses for the Volkswagen funding, trying to reduce emissions from diesel sources in these different categories. The most requested use of the funds in the early rounds of public comment were for replacing school buses. And replacing an entire school bus is not a very cost-effective way to reduce emissions compared to some other things like repowering a locomotive, for example. But because children are the most vulnerable population to the effects of diesel exhaust and those pollutants, because they are younger and their lungs are still developing and they breathe at a faster rate. That is why we put the emphasis on school buses, and we allocated 20% of our funds to replacing old school buses. And that was one of the first things we did with it. School and transit buses and electric vehicle charging were the different options that were available. So we opted to allocate just over half of our funds to on-road vehicles, school buses, transit buses, and heavy-duty trucks over 3 cycles, 2018, 2019, 2020. And then about a quarter of the funds for non-road equipment. So we've spent about $2 million on ferries and tugboats. We've allocated $5 million for switcher locomotives, and the airport and port cargo handling equipment categories combined, we allocated about $12 million too. Ohio's plan also, states are allowed to allocate a maximum of 15% of their VW funds for charging stations for zero emission vehicles. And those are for passenger cars. And so that amount of Ohio's settlement comes out to about $11 million. So that was the other part of our funding allocation. And just to show you a little bit of our progress along the way, we have allocated over 11 million of the 15 million from school buses, 4 school buses. We have set aside about $3 million for an electric school bus pilot project, and we will be releasing a request for applications for those later this year to demonstrate the performance of electric school buses in Ohio's climate and Ohio's terrain. So transit buses, we've nearly spent all of the funds that were available for that. Class 4 to 7 and Class 8 heavy-duty trucks, we've actually overspent a little because we saw very strong demand in those sectors, and we had a pandemic with a lot of economic disruption in the past year, as you all know. And so demand from public sector projects such as the transit systems dropped. Obviously, the airport air transit industry has been very much affected by this, and so demand has not been what we originally anticipated for ground support equipment, which is why we have more funding still available in that category. And then of the electric vehicle charging, we spent all of the money that we allocated for tugboats and ferries. And on the electric vehicle charging, we did our first release this spring, of a little over 3 million for what we call level 2 or slow chargers. And those will be being installed over the next year or two into 22 different counties. And then later this year, we will offer another request for applications for what are called DC fast chargers, which we want to see located along our major interstate corridors and other major transportation routes. So that will still be coming, and that will, we think, use up that cycle, that allocation. So our timeline in the original VW plan was to put 15 million a year out for these various kinds of projects for a total of 45 million, and take a deep breath and see what we've done, which is what we're doing right now. And what we decided to do, because of the disruptions and the lack of funding so far, we decided to offer this cycle just to offer some of the unspent, unused funds for the cargo equipment and the switcher locomotive projects. So we are doing this cycle. After this cycle, we will evaluate what our demand has been, what our emission results have been across these 10 different uses, and we will propose a plan amendment and seek public comment on how to allocate the remaining funds. So things still to come. The electric school bus project will be coming, and we don't have a date yet, but we will be releasing that later this year. And we will be releasing an RFA for more electric vehicle charging stations. This time, the DC fast chargers, we expect to have about 7 million available for those. So turning now to this grant cycle, wanted to just share a couple of common mistakes we saw from applicants in the previous 3 years of funding and give you some suggestions on how to avoid those. Probably the most common problem we saw was just too little information provided in the text boxes in the narrative section of the grant application. If we ask you, how are you using the vehicle now that you're planning to replace, you need to give us a little more information than just it's rode hard and put away wet. Some of the applications were just about that brief. Another problem that we had in the first round for vehicles and for different kinds of equipment, you have to have a certificate of conformity from US EPA or the California Air Resources Board that the new engine that you want to buy conforms with national emission control laws. And those people had a lot of problems with those. And for motor vehicles, we took over figuring those out. But for switcher locomotives, be aware you will still have to secure one of those for the new engine that you want to put in or the new switcher that you want to purchase. There'll be more about that shortly. And then probably just the other main mistake is that no grant program is friendly to procrastinators. And if you wait until the very last couple of days to start an application, you may have difficulty getting all of the parts together. And I think the system may slow down just a bit on the last day or two when there are a lot of people in there using it. So we would encourage you to start early to get as much of the application entered into the software as you can. And then you have the option, don't hit that submit button, hit that save button, and then you can send to us what you have. And Alan or I will be happy to look at it and give you a pre-review, give you any suggestions, or let you know if we see any issues. So your scope description must include details. So when we ask you, how are you going to decommission the old engines? You need to be specific about that. Are you doing it, or are you having a third party do that? If the equipment moves around, we need to know how you're going to ensure that it's operating at least 75% of the time in those VW priority counties. And then are you going to ensure that your equipment is going to be maintained for a minimum of 5 years after the installation or the purchase of the new equipment? And then because the cargo handling equipment, the only fuel option that you can for the new is all electric. For switcher locomotives, you may use all electric or alternative fuels of various kinds. But if you're using an alternative fuel or all electric, you need to explain how that charging or that fueling is going to be available at the location where your equipment is operating. One of the questions is, are your mechanics trained to operate this kind of equipment? And how are you training your employees to use this equipment? Another lesson, equipment owners may request up to 75% of the cost to replace their existing diesel equipment with all electric. There are a couple of lower caps than 75% on some of the alternative fueled switchers. But if you ask for the full 75%, if you are competing with other projects that are asking for maybe only 50% of something similar, they will score better than you will because we are paying less in the dollar per ton of emission reductions that we're achieving. So the cost effectiveness of the emission reductions is the overarching factor among the many factors we consider in terms of who gets funded. Non-road equipment must be operating at least 1,000 hours per year, or you're not going to score well enough to be funded. As I mentioned, engine conformity certificates are needed for any non-electric switcher projects. Any electric equipment, all electric, is considered zero emission, and so you do not have to get those conformity certificates. But switcher owners, if you are looking at that for your locomotive, you will need to get those. It does take some time, particularly as things have slowed down during the pandemic. So you want to start early on that. In the grant application guidelines are links to the website to where to go to get that from US EPA or the CARB, the California Air Resources Board. And if you have trouble finding it, Alan Harness will be happy to help you. So some more changes. We are no longer requiring you to submit a quote from a scrap dealer for what your old equipment is likely to bring you in scrap value, but please be aware you must document how much you received in scrap value from whoever you salvaged it with. That has to accompany your request for reimbursement, and it also has to be included in your closing report. And the grant payment that you receive will deduct that amount. So be aware of that and keep records. We do not fund leased equipment in this program for a number of reasons that have to do with the project periods, how long it takes, and the difficulty of an engine being decommissioned by one owner when the new vehicle or equipment is owned by a different owner. If you would like a pre-review, we need you to enter as much of the application as you can. When you get to the end of the process, before you hit that final submit button, there is an option to generate a PDF file of the application. You can do that, save it to your computer, and then you can email that to Alan or me, and we will be happy to look at it and give you a pre-review. When you do, you need to also send us your fleet data spreadsheet, which is an Excel spreadsheet that has the engine data for the old equipment and the new equipment that you propose to purchase. And so send us the PDF and plus send us the Excel spreadsheet of your fleet data. Please do that no later than August 6th. I can tell you that that first and second week of August, Alan and I will be very, very busy responding to questions. So the earlier you can get us your draft for pre-review, the more we will appreciate it and the more time we can give it. Once you get our feedback, you make any changes, then you can generate and save a new PDF later when you submit the final version of your application. If you have applied previously and you were not funded, you will have to fill out the online application again and answer the questions, but you do have the ability to go back and copy and paste text from the previous text box narratives into the new application. Be sure to update your attachments before you upload them. And if your quote for the new equipment is more than 6 months old, we would really encourage you to get a new updated quote to make sure that you are asking for enough funding if there's been a price increase. Previously funded applicants, if you have an application that is open and still open, not closed by July 31st of this year, you may not apply this cycle. If you are in the end stages of a project and you think you're going to be coming in pretty close to the wire, please talk to us, make sure we are aware of that so that we don't shut you out of the system. If you have an open one, you cannot apply, can't have two open grants. The exception to that is if you have one of the just awarded EV charging grants that we did for level 2 EV chargers, those, it's fine if you have a grant there and you're also applying for a grant here. We don't see a lot of overlap between those two sets of grant applicants, but I'm sure there might be some. But if you have a previous grant for equipment like this or vehicles, then you cannot apply this cycle. One of the other things that we look at is that you may apply again if you've completed a previous VW funded project, but we do look at how much funding you might have received compared to other applicants in an effort to be fair and distribute the funds fairly. The engine information in that fleet data spreadsheet, please remember to upload that as an Excel file attachment. That is the one attachment that you cannot upload as a PDF. If you give it as a PDF, we will have to chase you down and have you give us the Excel file because we use the Excel file to directly input your data, your engine data, to US EPA's diesel emission quantifier, and we can't do that from a PDF. If you are a non-government entity, if you are a nonprofit or a for-profit institution, you have to demonstrate the ability to cover upfront the costs of your entire project while you are awaiting reimbursement from the grant. There are two ways to do this. You can do a document an acceptable credit rating or a letter from your financial institution showing that you have a line of credit is what we most typically see. That financial institution can be a bank, credit union, or a savings and loan whose operations are regulated and examined by a federal or state agency in the United States. So sorry, the Bank of the Cayman Islands is not what we're looking for. How do we compare apples and oranges? We look at the cost effectiveness within each category, within each silo of allowable uses. For example, we will look at all of the airport ground support equipment projects, which are in one silo, and which are the most cost effective. We will look at the highest ranking projects in the port cargo handling silo, which also includes distribution centers. And do that. And we'll look at the separate silo, the highest ranking projects in the switcher locomotive category. And then we do the best we can to allocate the available funds fairly. We do consider balance among the different sectors based on what is allocated in our plan. And we do consider, excuse me, sorry. We, Alan, jump in here. We do consider geographic balance in making awards, making sure that we're funding all regions of the state fairly. Alan, can you speak up here for a minute, please?
Alan, you're muted.
As Carolyn was saying, when we go to the applications, as part of that is going to be the fleet data spreadsheet. That's going to contain the information that I will use to calculate the emission reduction estimates. So double check the information you have on there, specifically the make, model year, the annual fuel usage, annual miles traveled, estimated idling hours. We understand for the most part they're going to be estimates, but make them as close as possible. I'll do that, and that's going to be for all the applications we receive. And again, they'll be put in different silos. So airport ground GSC will be in one silo, basically a whole list of them. The locomotives and the marine projects will have their own separate categories. And then we'll rank them according to cost effectiveness based upon the amount the applicant is willing to put in towards the project and come up with a cost effectiveness figure. You can run the deck for yourself. If you want me to show you how to do it, I've got the email address on there and phone number. Feel free to give me a call. I show you how it works. It's not that hard. And let's see here. If you want to, if you want to contrast to compare it, see how it works, that type of thing. I don't have the next slide. Okay, there we go. And it does. And as it says right there, basically, the older the vehicle, the more pollution it's going to throw out, which means the more pollution we're going to be able to recruit with a newer vehicle. So you're going to score a little bit higher with an older vehicle. You're going to score higher with a vehicle that has more operating hours, travels more miles, that type of thing. For the most part, these are more of the off-road projects. So you pretty much, we're looking at hours of operation here. Let's see here. Put in, again, when you get this, you're probably going to score a bit higher when you have not just a single vehicle, but several vehicles that were calculating emission reductions at the same time. Fuel used, idling hours. Sorry, what's the next idling? What's the next little slide here? There we go. Again, this is the map of Ohio with the first and second party counties. As Carolyn said earlier, we're targeting those counties that have been, they're the worst in ozone right now. And NOx is a precursor for ozone along with VOC emissions. So we're really targeting projects that we can use in those specific counties. We're going to consider the secondary counties, yes. Some of your vehicles, boats, the locomotives may operate in some of the secondary counties at a time, but we've got to make sure that 75% of the time they're operating in those priority counties. Okay, what's the next slide?
Okay, I can step back in here. I apologize for that. The Volkswagen settlement requires competitive purchasing to make sure that the public funds are being used for the best benefit. And note that you will be submitting a quote from a vendor with your application, but the vendor who supplies that quote may be different from the vendor who's ultimately selected for the project if a grant is awarded. And grant recipients are required to use purchasing processes applicable to them under state procurement laws. So public sector applicants, you have your own public purchasing, public procurement requirements. Private sector applicants, some of those apply to you and some of those do not. Ohio EPA does allow state term contracts and other competitive purchasing agreements where you can get the best possible pricing. And just a note for consultants, if you are preparing VW grant applications for more than one applicant, be aware that you can only have one application in progress at a time with your user email address. So if you're working on one, you have to complete it and submit it before you start working on another one, or use different user credentials and a different email address so that you can be working on multiple projects at once. Okay, a couple of notes by sector on freight switcher locomotives. The funding is available to upgrade any pre-Tier 4 switchers, and Alan can help you if you're not sure how old your switcher is. And just for everyone to understand, switcher locomotives are not those that go out on live track and run all over the country. Switcher locomotives are those that are usually operating in rail yards, helping to put trains together, move cars back and forth. So the pollution from those large locomotives tends to be concentrated in one place, and that's why they are a good target for reducing emissions. So this is upgrading pre-Tier 4 switchers, so Tier 0, 1, 2, or 3 are all eligible. They need to be operating at least 1,000 hours a year to current emission standards, and you're going to replace them with new diesel, alternative fuel like CNG, or all electric. And gensets are one of the options you can choose, not the only option for all electric. Ohio's plan has allocated $5 million for this category, and we've already spent about $2 million, but I wanted to be sure you understand. If you have a big project, please talk to us because we do have some other funding sources we can cobble together. And on technical aspects, we work closely with the Ohio Rail Development Commission over at the Ohio Department of Transportation, and they can also provide you good technical assistance on putting your project together. For airport ground support equipment, and I'm calling it port cargo handling equipment, they don't have a specific year of eligibility like we do for motor vehicles, but it needs to be eligible diesel or spark ignition equipment operating outdoors, and the only option you can replace it with is all electric, and that is a requirement of the VW settlement. So airport shuttles, fueling trucks, drayage trucks, we have funded some of those in our previous grant cycles, but those are not eligible this cycle. This is strictly for ground support equipment. If you have a question about whether a piece of equipment or a forklift is eligible, give us a call, we'll figure it out. Or I should say specifically, give Alan a call and he will figure that out for you. So moving to how to fill out the grant application, please read the application guidelines first. Those are posted, and if you don't already have one, you will need to go into Ohio EPA's Customer Support Center and set up your credentials, your account. That's basically just telling them who you are, and they will give you a login and password to use the system. Then as you're working on that, you can be gathering the information on your existing equipment, gather quotes for the new equipment or the new engine or the repower that you want to do, and then begin working in the grant cycle and just save as you're working, and it will save all that information for you and you can come and go. So when you go to Ohio EPA's website and you go to that main application page, epaohio.gov OEE, go to the VW Mitigation Grant tab, And that's where you will find all the information. And I'll just point out, down here below is the Customer Support Center button, that lower button on the right with the two figures there. That is where you'll go to get the actual software for the filling out your application. But this gray tab, VW Mitigation Grants, is where you go to get the grant application guidelines and all of the information. So when you pull up that gray tab and you're looking at it, down at the bottom of that page are a number of what we call accordion links. And the first of those accordion links you will click on where you see the arrow pointing there, and that is labeled DMTF, which is Diesel Mitigation Trust Fund, 2021 Request for Applications to Replace Diesel Off-Road Equipment. And this is where you will find the application guidelines, the links for the webinars. We will be putting the Q&A up in this location as well. So when you're ready to start filling out an application, you go to the Customer Support Center. And when you go there, you will find several things along the top: find resources, submit a question, subscribe to updates, Permit Wizard, and submit an application. So the first thing you're going to want to do is to set up your credentials. Once you have credentials, you see there in the top right where it says log in or sign up. So you can sign up. You can search in our system. We call it the Diesel Mitigation Trust Fund. You can search by DMTF. You can search for Volkswagen. All of those searches will bring you to the information. When you get to here are the specific instructions for how to apply for ours. Look at the grant application guidelines on the VW part of our website, and then the application form is here. And if you're doing a repower, this is a reminder that you don't want to get run sideways with the Clean Air Act anti-tampering laws. Okay, once you get into submitting a grant application, this is where you will log in with your username and password once you have those credentials assigned. Now, if you look at this arrow on the bottom left of your screen, you see where it says Diesel Mitigation Trust Fund Grant, and then there are a number of other grant programs in the same area. That Diesel Mitigation Trust Fund Grant will not be a live link unless you are logged in with credentials. If you're just browsing looking for funding, you won't see it. And there over on the right, you'll see the instructions is a live link. Until you are logged in with your credentials, you can't actually get to the application. So be sure and set up your credentials first. And then when you log in, that link at the bottom, Diesel Mitigation Trust Fund, that will be live and you can go straight to your applications. Okay, just a second, I'm having a little trouble advancing here. Okay, here we go. As you're working on your application, across the top of your screen, you will always see this series of what we call train stops. And that will show you how far along you are in your application. And you can move your cursor to these different train stops where you see the first arrow or the second arrow where you see screen 4. For example, we're in the fleet eligibility section, and there are a bunch of questions to answer. Screen 1, screen 2, screen 3, screen 4 in this section. So you can use that if you need to go back a few pages. It's a more efficient way of going backward and forward. Okay, so then as you move down, you have drop-down menus for replace or repower so that it will offer you the menus of ground support equipment, cargo handling equipment, or switcher locomotives, or what you'll see in the drop-down menus this cycle. As you're working in the system, every time you move to the next page, your work will be saved. So if you move back and change anything, once you leave that page, it will be saved again. So there's also a drop-down menu where you can tell us where your equipment is currently located or operating, and it's a drop-down menu of the 26 eligible counties in Ohio. And then when you tell us, are the vehicles currently operational? If your vehicle is on its last leg and is parked somewhere, not your vehicle, your equipment in this case, it has to have been working in the previous 2 years. We want to look at that. So you have to certify that here, and you have to give us a little more information about that later in a text box. So the existing age for the different categories, it gives you how old you think that is, and you'll provide that in your fleet data as well. And then the requested amount. And the system will prompt you how much you are allowed to ask for. And then it will keep adjusting as you add additional equipment. So if you are looking for 5 pieces of aircraft tugs, and 2 of cranes or forklifts, every time you add something new, it will factor that in and tell you how much you can request. And it will ask you, what's the total cost to you to replace, let's say, this aircraft tug? And then you can request 75% of that in the grant. So what would be the funding request for that aircraft tug? So you would say, if this is a new piece of equipment that's going to cost $100,000, you would put that in the first box. And then what's the funding request? How much are you asking for from the grant? And you could put up to $75,000 in that lower box where you see that. If you mess up anywhere along the way, it will give you text in red just below the train stops at the top that will tell you what the problem is and why it might not be letting you advance. It will also give you a funding request summary that will say how much you're asking from the grant and what is the match that's being offered. So here's where you see an example of the red text. Caution, please realize these are competitive grants. Requesting more than 25% of funding, for example, for vehicles, you would have trouble competing with many other grant applicants. For this kind of equipment, for cargo handling equipment, there's not going to be as much variation as there is when we're looking at motor vehicles, but you'll be able to put that in off your match, and then you can go back and adjust that match if you choose to. So for current use, this is where you will have a text box, and we want you to explain to us how you are using your old equipment currently. How many hours does it operate typically? How many days of the week? If it's in one particular location, or if you happen to move it between locations, this is where you would be explaining all of that to us. And on each of our text boxes, there is a character counter. So the text boxes are limited to 1,000 characters for the most part. If you are typing along and it suddenly stops because you've run out of space, you may always upload an extra file with extra information. Just make a note of that there to say, please see attached, and we will look at that attachment. So the text boxes will keep you something. Just in general, the mistake we see is people not giving us enough information rather than too much information. So on maintenance here, again, please, because you are looking for replacing traditional diesel equipment with new all-electric equipment, we want you to tell us how you're going to maintain it to make sure you are maintaining it in accordance with the manufacturer specifications. And important things that we're interested in are your mechanics going to be trained to maintain this equipment properly? How are you going to train them? How are you going to ensure that they are able to do this and do it safely? So that's the kind of information we're looking for that we would like for you to give us some detail on. How are you going to ensure that the vehicles or the equipment is going to be fueled and maintained and according to the manufacturer specs? That also is, if you are putting in all electric equipment, we need to know whether you have charging on site for that equipment. Do you have it in place now? Is it going to be installed in the next 6 months? What's your schedule for that? And is it going to be available? If you're going with a CNG fueled switcher, for example, do you have fueling available on site? How will you be able to do that? When you get to your attachments, you can add any additional attachments you need to. The software will not check the contents of your attachments. That's up to Alan and me and Ryan and Loudon with our human judgment to look at that. It will just say whether or not one has been uploaded. You can combine all of your attachments into a single PDF. The one exception to that is that your fleet data does need to be uploaded as an Excel file and not as PDF, please, or we will have to track you down before we can review your application. You can add additional ones as you need to. When you get to the signature is by the person who is applying for the grant, and that could be a consultant who is filling out the application. So when you sign here, and you can use your name, you'll get some interesting handwriting, you can use your mouse. When you're signing, you are certifying that you are authorized to submit on behalf of your agency or your company or your client. So the signature on your application in the software does not have to be from your CEO. It can be from your consultant or your grant writer. When the time comes, if you are awarded a grant to sign a contract, that contract will have to be signed by whoever is authorized to sign contracts for your client or your company. But for the application, you are certifying that you are authorized to submit this application on behalf of your company or your client. So you can see up here, you can log in, you can log out, you can work on your document and go away and come back later and work on it again, and it will save your work. And so you can always click on, if you click on, you see the log out, everybody knows what that's for, but where it says account there in parentheses, that's where you can actually go to see what documents have you already uploaded. And your list of uploads will be there, and you can go back and check and say, oh, I had uploaded this quote, but now I have a better quote from a different vendor. So if you want to go back and take the first one out and put in a different one, you can do that. And going to that little account is where you go to find out where all of your uploaded documents are. So that's a pretty much of an overview. We have a pop quiz for you today before we start looking at the Q&A. And the first one is, what is the latest time to submit a grant application this cycle? Our second question is a true false. A school district can apply for all electric school buses this cycle. And our third question, an airport can apply for CNG fueled ground support equipment this cycle. And our answers, the latest time you can submit this cycle is 3 p.m. on Friday the 13th. What could go wrong on a Friday the 13th? 3 p.m. on August 13th is the deadline for submitting. Please don't try to submit at 4 p.m. You will be disappointed. And you cannot apply for electric school buses this cycle. That will be a separate application cycle later this year. And the only fuel that airport ground support equipment can be replaced with is all electric. That is a condition of the settlement. So those were our pop quiz questions. I'll put our contact information up here for Alan on any engine questions, for me on any money questions, and we do our best to back each other up if one of us is not available in the office. So try either one of us, and we will do our best to help you, or we might have Ryan Borgard in our office also contact you with the answers to some of your questions. So, Ryan, I'm going to ask what we have in the Q&A, if anything, so far.
Yes, we have a few questions. When you say replace off-road diesel equipment, what are acceptable replacements, and what is considered an acceptable replacement? For example, electric vehicle, low emission diesel, etc.
For this cycle, we are limited to those 3 silo categories where we've not yet spent all of the available funds. So for replacements for cargo handling equipment, so this is gantry cranes, straddle carriers, big forklifts, for those kinds of things, the only thing that the grants will fund is replacing an existing diesel with all electric. So you will have to do some research to find out who are vendors that are offering all electric equipment of the type that you want to use to replace a current one of the same size. That's the only fuel option. For switcher locomotives, you have several options. You can replace an old switcher or repower an old switcher to diesel, a newer, cleaner diesel engine, or a new diesel switcher, or an alternative fueled diesel switcher, or alternative fueled switcher that might be operating on CNG, or an all-electric switcher. And the all-electric switcher may be a genset or it may be a different format, but those are the only, that's the only category where you can do anything other than all-electric is in the switcher category. And we will definitely review your application, but you will score better if you look at an all-electric switcher rather than some of those other fuel options, because you will be going to a zero emission source. And we are looking at what is the most bang for the buck we can get in terms of emission reductions per dollar spent from a grant. Alan, you want to add anything on that?
Alan, you're muted.
Oops. Okay, Ryan, why don't you go ahead to the next question?
Okay. For airport ground support equipment, any thoughts on what diesel engines are eligible? Could it be possible to replace equipment with electric vehicles that are newer than the original diesel engine age threshold?
The requirement on airport ground support equipment is that you are replacing Tier 0, Tier 1, or Tier 2 airport ground support equipment. And it needs to be either uncertified or certified to 3, it says G per BHP per hour, or higher emissions, or spark ignition engine powered airport ground support equipment. So there's not a specific year, but Alan can help you determine if your existing equipment is Tier 0, Tier 1, or Tier 2.
Okay. Would diesel backup generators being replaced by battery storage qualify?
If the backup generator is a standalone, it will not be eligible under this program. If it is a backup generator that is actually built into a piece of equipment like a straddle carrier, then it would be eligible, but standalones are not.
Thank you. Can you replace an old leased equipment with a new purchased equipment and the leased unit go away?
We have a really hard time doing leases because you have to certify the destruction of the old engine. And if somebody else owns that, that really complicates that, which is why we've basically stopped doing any leased equipment. So absolutely not for a new equipment being leased. It has to be purchased. For old equipment, if you have a lease in place, you're going to need to jump through a bunch of hoops to show us that you have the permission of the owner to destroy, decommission that piece of equipment entirely. So I would say talk to Alan or talk to me about exactly how that works. But it's very, very difficult for us to do anything involving leases when you've got two different entities owning the old versus the new equipment.
So for clarity, someone brought up that we have, I guess, a discrepancy between the RFA and the presentation. RFA says that applications are due August 7th, but we're saying it's due August 13th. So could you please clarify which one is correct?
It should be August 13th. Friday the 13th. I will go in and verify that that's what the system is set for. It opened on June 7th and it should close on August 13th, but we will verify that and clarify that on the website.
Okay. With airport equipment, do you include the cost of the infrastructure in the proposal?
The charging infrastructure is not something that we're paying for with Ohio's program. You can include that in your match to make your match look more generous as part of the overall project cost, but we will not pay for the charging infrastructure. We expect the grant applicant to bring that to the table as part of their support for the project.
Okay, I think that's all we have right now.
All right, we'll hold it open for a minute in case anybody thinks of any more good head scratchers for us. Alan, is there anything you'd like to add?
Alan, you're on mute.
Forgot I was on mute. Okay. To reiterate what I just said, this thing's open till August 13th. You're probably going to have some questions. Feel free to contact Carolyn on any questions you may have, whether it's about what's eligible, what's not eligible. If you want to learn how to run the deck, it's an easy, I can show you how to do it, even though I'll be doing it from my end. But any questions in general, feel free to give Carolyn and I a call or an email.
Yeah, I see now, I'm looking at the RFA that it does say August the 7th, and our understanding is that it is August the 13th is the deadline. I will go back and verify that in the system to make sure that it will still accept your applications through August 13th, 3 p.m. And I will put that correction onto the RFA on the website. Ryan, do you see any other questions coming in?
Nope, I don't see any more.
All right, we thank you for your attention today. We will have another webinar on June 23rd that will essentially go over the same information. And we will be posting the Q&As to the program website. We will also publish the slides from the webinar on the program website after we finish the second webinar to make sure we've gotten all of any glitches taken care of. So we will keep you posted. Keep those questions coming in. Alan or Ryan or I will be happy to try to help you with those. And we thank you very much for coming today.